Good morning, everybody. Here in Miami area, in the United States, in other countries of Americas, and maybe around the world. My name is Martin Palouš. I'm director of Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy at Florida International University. I'm very proud and challenged to moderate this important discussion. It has been initiated by this year's report on the freedom in the world that is annually published by Freedom House. So Freedom House is main co-organizer of this event. Here at FIU, there are a couple of other entities besides Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy co-organizing that event. First of all, Kimberly Green Latin America and Caribbean Center, then Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy, and Dorothea Green Lecture Series. So thank to all of you for your participation and co-organization of this important event. This important event, will be focused on political rights and civil liberties in Latin America. Let me first to introduce those who have kindly agreed to participate in this panel discussion. First of all, Amy Slipovitz, Research Manager in Freedom House. Alexandra Pina, Senior Program Manager, Latin America and Caribbean Program in Freedom House. Then Pedro Vaca, who is a Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression in American Commission on Human Rights, which is part of Organization of American States. Last but not least, Luis Guillermo Solis, former President of Costa Rica, now Director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center at Florida International University. So without further ado, I would like to ask Amy to open up with her statement. Then we'll hear from Alexandra, then Pedro, and then Luis. And then we'll open it up for general discussion. So Amy, please, you have the word. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Florida International University for having us and to my fellow panelists as well. So I'm going to just take you through the global findings for freedom in the world, which I think will have some parallels to what is happening with democracy in Latin America specifically. Next slide, please. So first, just some background on the publication. Freedom in the World covers 210 countries and territories each year. And we're evaluating the state of freedom for people within the borders of these countries and territories. We're not looking at the governments themselves. And we do this based on a methodology of 25 indicators that cover different aspects of political rights and civil liberties on a scale from 0 to 100. So 0 would be the smallest degree of freedom and 100 would be the highest. And these indicators range from the credibility of elections, political pluralism, and functioning of government, to freedoms of expression and belief, assembly and association, as well as rule of law and personal autonomy. And based on these scores, the country is categorized as free, partly free, or not free, or green, yellow, and purple, as you see on the map. And countries are evaluated by external experts who we engage. The scores are then vetted by our team and a panel of advisors, and we then analyze the global findings, which I'll share with you now. Next slide, please. So it's probably not surprising to hear that 2020 saw the continued decline of global freedom. Freedom in the world has now tracked 15 consecutive years of decline, and this really sped up over the past year. What this means is that more countries are trending down than improving, and by the biggest margin since the 15-year decline began. So as you can see on this slide with the gray bars that dip down on the slide, this year was the largest gap between the number of countries that improved and those that declined. So we clearly have not yet stemmed the authoritarian tide, and in fact, it only seems to be getting stronger. Next slide, please. So you can see here that the share of countries designated not free has reached its highest level since democracy began to deteriorate in 2006. And those numbers are even more striking, I think, if you consider it from the perspective of the number of people affected. So the vast majority of people on Earth, 75%, live in countries where freedom is declining. This includes a range of countries, including those that are still considered free but are weakening, like the United States, and also some of the worst performing countries, like Cuba. Next slide, please. So what's driving this decline? One is the growing global influence of authoritarian actors. And I'll give the example of China. We've seen China exert almost complete control of Hong Kong. The new national security law has been used to arrest dozens of pro-democracy activists and politicians. Legislative elections were postponed for a year. And the Chinese Communist Party's control in Hong Kong doesn't just violate the freedom of the territory's citizens, but it's also in breach of the one country, two systems promise that was made to Hong Kong's people. And China's influence really ranges far beyond Hong Kong. So Beijing has ramped up its global disinformation and censorship campaign to counter the fallout from its cover-up of the initial coronavirus outbreak. It has also increased its meddling in the domestic political discourse of foreign democracies, and it's extending its repression across borders, so committing rights abuses abroad that have long been common in mainland China. And another thing is that the Chinese regime, along with many of its allies, have gained clout in multilateral institutions like the UN. China and its allies are pushing for so-called non-interference in other countries' affairs, but what it's really pushing for are new norms that allow abuses of democratic principles and human rights standards to go unpunished. So in this environment, it's perhaps to be expected that one of the developments we saw last year was the crushing of pro-democracy movements in countries that had had new hopes for democracy. So in 2019, massive protests broke out in all regions of the world. But what we saw in 2020 was that many of these civic movements were thwarted by the authoritarians they were aiming to overthrow. Freedom House tallied up 39 countries and territories that had a major protest in 2019. And of these, as you can see on the slide, 23 saw their overall freedom decline in 2020. And that's nearly 60% of protests, leading later to a decline. One example I'll give from 2020 is Belarus. So there, the popular movement that started after the fraudulent elections in August has not died out yet. But the hope that we had in the early days when it seemed like Lukashenko was on the defensive is much less bright now that protests have dragged on for months with no change in the regime. And this kind of extinguishing of hope goes beyond protests. As an example, Ethiopia was a major bright spot of the past couple of years. So when Prime Minister Abiy came to power, he instituted really welcome reforms like lifting restrictions on opposition media and political groups. But longtime ethnic and political tensions did remain there. And in 2020, a devastating conflict erupted in the Tigray region. This has displaced tens of thousands of people. And Ethiopia is set to hold elections in June. What we had hoped would be a chance for the country to continue on with its democratic reforms now looks more like an opportunity for instability. Next slide, please. So one pretty staggering statistic is that less than 20% of all people now live in a free country. And one of the major drivers of that is India's drop from free to partly free this past year. So it is true that India held very successful elections in 2019, but democracy, of course, is about much more than just elections. India had a very big drop in our ratings after that vote as Prime Minister Modi consolidated his rule and really prioritized Hindu nationalist interests over the inclusion and equal rights principles that the country was founded on. And in 2020, the government really intensified its crackdown on protesters, particularly those who were protesting against a discriminatory citizenship law, Authorities arrested dozens of journalists who criticized the official pandemic response and also interfered in the judiciary. As the world's largest democracy, I think India could really serve as a champion of democratic practice and a really powerful counterweight to authoritarian influence from China. But instead, Modi and his party are tragically driving India towards authoritarianism. Next slide. So I'll turn now to the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on democracy. The pandemic has really given undemocratic leaders an opportunity to consolidate power. And we saw this in all types of countries, from backsliding democracies like Hungary to wavering democracies like Sri Lanka to dictatorships like Cambodia. One area where we saw significant declines was in transparency. So governments across all regime types were less than forthright with COVID data. Some misled people about having the pandemic under control, about treatments that turned out to be ineffective or even harmful, or about the origins of the virus. And a handful like Nicaragua and Turkmenistan even denied the existence of the virus in their countries altogether. Our major concern, though, is that the pandemic is leading to long-lasting consequences for democracy that will persist after the pandemic has subsided. So I think most recently we've seen this in Myanmar, where last month the military deposed the country's civilian government. And interestingly, Myanmar's de facto leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, as well as the democratically elected president, were arrested on trumped-up charges. They apparently broke pandemic-related rules against interacting with crowds. So I think this type of action will be taken in the long term. Next slide. So democracy is also weakening in the United States. It is still a free country, but its score fell by 3 points in 2020 on our 100-point scale. And this is a really large drop for an established democracy in a single year for freedom in the world. But what's more, this decline is not new. We've actually been tracking a decline in the US over the past decade, and it's fallen by a total of 11 points. What we're most recently concerned about in 2020 were violence against journalists and mass arrests at protests, as well as dismissal of inspectors general and the undermining of other norms that are meant to hold government leaders accountable. There's also a lack of transparency around COVID-19 prevention and treatment. But what was especially damaging to the US's democracy were former President Trump's attempts to overturn the will of the American voters. He propagated baseless claims that the electoral system was ridden with fraud, and even after the courts gave these claims fair hearing and rejected them, continued to sow doubt among a significant portion of Americans. So when democratic nations like the United States backslide or show weakness, that really gives authoritarian actors something to point to and also space to claim that democracy is inherently inferior. Russian propagandists, to take one example, had a field day with the January 6th insurrection. But there is still plenty of reason for hope. This was judged to be the most secure election in US history. The media and the judiciary held the executive accountable, and ultimately there was a peaceful transfer of power. So just to end on a positive note, there is clearly still a demand for freedom, as we're seeing now with people on the streets in Myanmar and elsewhere. But we really need to be honest that for now, dictators and authoritarians do have an edge on democracy. To start to reverse this, it's really important for democratic governments themselves to begin to strengthen their own democracies, and also for them to work more in solidarity with one another, and also with democracy advocates and human rights defenders in authoritarian settings. I think by starting to do this, this will begin to help reverse the 15 years of accumulated declines. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opening, and I think a very important statement, because obviously decline of democracy, it's our great concern, and your data speak for themselves. And the basic trust in democracy might be shaken in the minds of many. But still, I read positive signals in your report too about resilience of democracy, which is certainly dependent on Democrats, on people who are like-minded in that context and are looking for anything we can do in our place, how to reverse the trend and preserve democracy as a most cherished form of government, I think, for global mankind. But anyways, now Alexandra Hina, Senior Program Manager, Latin American Caribbean Program in Freedom House. Let's see what this situation is doing in Americas, in maybe region we are now living in.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the Florida International University. So in this presentation, I'm going to analyze the political rights and civil liberties in Latin America. In special ways, I will focus this presentation on the Latin American countries with a sight to the Americas. Please go to the next slide. As we could see from the Freedom in the World 2021 map, there is much more green in this region in comparison with many other areas in the globe. Out of 35 countries, we have 21 free countries, 11 partially free, and 3 not free countries. Giving a special look at the group of free countries, we see that there are many English-speaking countries and the Caribbean islands. However, it's important to identify 3 successful stories of resilient Latin American democracies: Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica. Uruguay has a score of 98 out of 100, exactly the same score of Canada. And these 2 countries represent the leaders in the group of free countries in the Americas. Chile has a score of 93 and Costa Rica a score of 91. Looking at the partially free countries, this group is dominated by Latin American countries. And the not free countries are 3: Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. Traditionally, Cuba is the country in our region with the lowest score, and this year confirms this position with a score of 13. But Venezuela in the past years decreased so far to be just 1 point away from Cuba with a score of 14. Please, let's go to the next slide. So the 21 free countries represent the 60% of the countries of the region, and they have 65% of the regional population. The 11 partially free countries represent the 31% of the countries of the region, that they have 30% of our regional population. The 3 not free countries represent 9% of the countries of the Americas, and they have 5% of the population. Please, let's go to the next slide. So despite the positive note that the majority of the population in the Americas live in free countries, unfortunately, the trend is negative as in the rest of the world. Looking at the last issue of Freedom in the World, we see a decline in 15 countries in the Americas. And these declines happened in all the 3 different groups. But the 3 different groups, depending on their status, have been impacted in different ways. 6 free democracies lost some points, and they represent a little bit less than a third of the total number of free countries. 6 partially free countries lost between 1 and 3 points, and they represent 50% of the total number of partially free countries. Instead, 100% of the not free countries experience a decline of 1 or 2 points. The countries that had the highest declines are United States and El Salvador. They both lost 3 points. Peru lost just 1 point. However, it was sufficient to change its status. Last year, Peru was a free country, and this year it became a partially free country. The reason of the decline of Peru in the past couple of years is especially due to the dysfunctional relationship between Congress and the presidency. Indeed, in the past 3 years, Peru had 4 different presidents. Something that is common to all this decline is very much the reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic. We can divide the reactions in 2 different groups. A group of countries decided to actually downplay the harm of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we saw this in the United States, Brazil, Mexico, and Nicaragua. However, the way that this has been done and the impact of this behavior was different depending on the nature of the political systems. If we look at the United States, former President Trump decided to release just partial information on COVID-19. However, the American people had access to the information of scientists and free media. This is not what happened, for example, in Nicaragua, where the government decided to actually deny the the presence of COVID-19 inside the border of Nicaragua. They even called the demonstrations in the street to prove that there was not COVID-19 in the country. And then scientists, doctors, and nurses that they wanted to actually share information very much in line with the information on COVID in the rest of the world have been directly attacked and harassed. The second group of countries instead recognized the existence of COVID and the importance of adopting some countermeasures to try to arrest or at least mitigate contagions. However, in this country, we also saw some misuse of force or abuse of force in order to enforce these rules. And we saw this in Argentina, in El Salvador, in Venezuela. But once again, the way that has happened and the impact of these actions was different depending on the nature of the political system. While in Argentina, these were very much incidents and limited, in Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro took COVID-19 as the perfect opportunity to actually use the force to increase the control on dissent and to silence independent media. Especially is interesting the case of Cuba. So immediately after the beginning of the spread of COVID-19, Cuba started to send abroad missions of Cuban doctors. And these have been used to basically increase and improve the image of Cuba in the international sphere, and completely in line with the propaganda of the regime. In November, when in Cuba we saw the important actions of form of dissent, non-violent dissent of the artist part of Movimiento San Isidro as a consequence or an answer of the arbitrary arrest of the rapper Venezuelans, the Cuban regime used the COVID-19 as the motivation to actually silence this group. So the manipulation of COVID-19 definitely has been an important factor in the closest environment in our country. We can go to the next. So while 15 countries decreased their score, only 6 improved their democracy and freedom. It's important to highlight that only four democracies or free countries improve their score, and two are partially free. Actually, Ecuador and Bolivia went both through important electoral events, and actually Ecuador is still in the middle of their elections. So it's very important that before we celebrate these improvements, we see the effects of the result of the elections. And so I think that 2021 will be an important year for both these countries. Chile improved from 90 to 93, and this is giving hope in the sense that last year, unfortunately, Chile had a decrease due to the response to demonstrations in the street, but this improvement is making us thinking that the result of that incident. So if we can move to the next slide, we are going to see that unfortunately the decrease of this year is part of a pattern, as Amy was describing, a pattern that is happening in the past 10, 15 years. If we look at this slide where there are the largest 10-year declines, we see that Venezuela is on the fifth place with a decline of 28 points, and Nicaragua is in the following place with a decline of 24 points. El Salvador is in position 20 with a decline of 12 points, and the United States on position 25 with a decline of 11 points. So this slide makes us thinking that unfortunately are the closest countries that are becoming worse and worse in terms of their fight towards democracy. And this is even more evident if we see the next slide, where we analyze the situation of the past 15 years, where Venezuela is second to Mali only for the largest decline. Mali lost 41 points, going from a free to a not free status, and Venezuela lost 40 points, passing from a partially free to a not free status. Nicaragua also is among the worst countries that have experienced the major decline. If we go to the next slide, we see the declines just in focus in the Americas, in our region. The major declines affected four countries that 15 years ago were free, and only the United States is staying free, even if they lost the position to be a strong democracy with a score of 93, so very strong, and now instead has a score of 83. But Dominican Republic, El Salvador, and Mexico passed from free to partially free. Honduras is staying in the category of partially free, but is much weaker. From 66, has now a score of 44. And Nicaragua and Venezuela, as we saw before, experienced some very major declines. So if we go to the next slide, we see instead the improvements in America. They are their significance is a little bit less in the sense that we have four Caribbean islands improving slightly their free status, and then we have Colombia gaining 5 points. Haiti passed from not free to a partially free status, and Cuba from 8 to 13. So let's try to close this presentation with some hope. Even this 2021 started in Cuba with lots of positive energy, despite obviously the regime answers with repression. But the reason why is the score of Cuba was from 8 to 13 is thanks to the strengthening of civil society and the independent media. So it's very important that as international institution, as democracy that we want to fight to increase democracy around the world, we really emphasize the importance of civil society and the independent journalists in this fight to improve rights, freedoms, and democratic government.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for this very interesting report. It seems to me obvious that we are dealing here with, I would say, three concentric circles. Each country needs to be evaluated on its own merits in its historical context and the current situation. Then we have a regional context, which certainly have a certain influence on the state of democracy in individual countries of the region. And then we have a global context. This is the state of the world. And here, certainly the role of the United States has certain specific significance. It has been traditionally experienced not only as a old and stabilized democracy, but beacon for other democracies in the world. And now we are in that situation you have described. But anyways, now let's hear from Pedro Vaca, who is expert in freedom of expression in Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Organization of American States. So we will, I am sure, hear from the regional perspective how the state of democracy is perceived. So Pedro, you have the floor.
Thank you, Martin. And also it's a pleasure to be with Alessandra, Amy, Luis, and I would like to, first of all, congratulate the report. It's always a pleasure to read Freedom House's reports, I would say, for at least two reasons. The first one is the consistent methodology. So we have a comparison year by year of the state of freedoms around the world in specific matters. And the second reason is that these trends that could be synced with the findings help people like us, like the Commission of Human Rights of the OAS, to a better understanding of the region we are working with. So this report, from my perspective, is a solid contribution for the debate around democracy and freedoms around the world. In the past, I have had the responsibility of being part of the Freedom of the Net report, and I also admire the professionalism of all the people's work that is behind Freedom House's report. In this day, I would like to express a special thanks to the women that worked on this report and event. And for all these reasons, it's an honor for me to share some comments about the Freedom in the World report that was recently presented by Amy and Alessandra in the world and in the regional scope. So getting in deep with the Americas and Latin American findings, I would like to share 5 thoughts that came to my mind while reading this report. The first one is I would say the scary normalization of drastic freedom restrictions and deterioration. So we clearly know that, for example, the situation in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, and Cuba deserve a special reading, a special study, and also special actions. In these countries, we will look with deep concern the situation of social movements, of artists, of critics, of media, of journalism, and the deterioration is getting worse each year. So the layer of rule of law erosionated, there's another layer of the pandemic, and also the border and the wall in between the style of those governments and the compatibility or not, I would say, the disregard of these behaviors of governments of human rights. So we have a lot of reports from the UN, from the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, for several special rapporteurs, including my office, that constantly are saying that the restrictions of freedom in these countries are really worried and that we should turn to another path of democratic working in these countries. The second thought that came to my mind is there's a slide in the report that makes a comparison between the free countries, the partly free countries, and the not free countries. And when I think about the partly free countries in Latin America, I think they are closer to not free than to free. So it's not only the category, but also the trend that we are looking, and it's very worried because if the trend keeps being the same, this decline, we're going to have more in the future years, more not free countries than partly free countries. And our hope would be that those partly free countries should improve. So there's a lot of work to do in other countries. We have to take special attentions to countries like El Salvador and Peru that are flagged in this report in this partly free category. The third thought that come to my mind is the US decline on freedom, but not only the US decline, but also its possible effect in the Latin American region. Something that it's clear in our region is that there's kind of a mirror, no, and even a lot of political leaders for several years has been inspired by the US way to deal with politics. So I think that even when we can say that the US is dealing with the rule of law through a very sensitive crisis, I think that these trends of behaviors are being looked by other social leaders in Latin America, where the rule of law is not with the same strength, where the rule of law is fragile, where the rule of law is weak. So I think that's something we have to be taking care of, or at least monitoring through our fields. In this chapter, I think that something that we have also discussed in other scenarios and forums is the relationship between the deterioration of democracy and the restrictions to liberties with the voice of public leaders. So we have an ingredient, which is the stigmatization, the denigration of critics, of media outlets, including journalists, female journalists, when that denigration and stigmatization is done by public leaders or officials or governors. I think we have to pay attention to this, to the healthy environment to discuss democratic issues without getting into a stigmatization or denigration of the one that is criticizing the government or the public servitors. And then we have another ingredient that is clearly shown in the report, which is the pandemic. In the pandemic, it's another layer to a previous situation of a lot of challenges to democracy and liberties. My fourth comment to this report that I think could be discussed during this event or in further scenarios is the take approach to the speed of freedom deterioration. What is happening with technology? Because in technology we have a lot of the items that are allowing our societies to be more open. So we have, for example, the case of Cuba, where in this small improvement, when we take it around the years, it's also supported on more people accessing to ways to express their ideas if we compare it with previous years. So so technology has a value or an added value, but also technology it's a path where the speed of restrictions is increasing. So the bias on the public debate and also the the violence in our democracies. I mean, when I say violence, it's not only physical violence, it's also a violence on the speech that could be promoted by a lot of actors, but mainly public leaders. So I think that the tech approach to the speed of this deterioration should be something important to study. And then I don't know if you agree with this, but I think that also the report reflects democratic resilience. No? And not when we look at 2020 as a year, as a very hard year, we could also say that if the findings are worrying, it could be worse. I mean, there are a lot of things to think that journalists are doing a great job. Independent media is working hard with no too much resources. And also we have public discussions for protecting democratic environment. I mean, that work is hard, but without that work that is done by several organizations, including multilateral bodies like the Commission of Human Rights at the OAS, would be worse, I would say. So looking to the future, I would like to share some bullet points, let's say, that could be part of, because we do not want more countries to be in the not free category. We want our societies to improve in this in the future reports. So it could be like very emotional from this side, but I think we have to put these concepts on the floor. I think we have to start discussing about public ethics. We have to push our leaders to a democratic approach when they participate in political discussions. We have to recognize that there's a challenge on quality in journalism. There are some cracks around the media environment that are being weaponized by people that do not believe in democracy to put the seeds of authoritarianism. I think we also have to start talking about literacy in freedoms. We have to put seeds on pluralism and democratic values. We need to protect our public deliberation, and we need to have positive models of leaders' behaviors with democratic values. So I appreciate this opportunity. I congratulate this report, and I am more than open to put the efforts of our office in the path of protecting freedoms and protecting democracy. Thank you, Martin, for the floor.
Pedro, thank you very much for this, I would say, slightly hopeful message sent. And let me just shortly comment on the capability of countries to improve. I think that there is a most important feature of open societies, the capacity for self-reflection and capacity for self-transformation based on this self-reflection. Obviously, we are now having new tools of communication that are somewhat ambiguous, that can help us to improve, and also then can be used as a tool of autocrats or those who certainly are not very much interested in improving the rating of their own country, but rather keeping themselves in power. I think that education is maybe the key thing. And this is actually an opportunity for me now to ask the last but not least participant in this panel, Luis Bermeo Solis, former president of Costa Rica, but right now director of very important entity at Florida International University, Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center. So Luis, please, floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin. I apologize. I thank you for your moderation. I also would like to congratulate Freedom House for this great report, and also thank the organizers for inviting me to come to comment it, and to do so in the International Day of Women is a great opportunity too. And I would like to, on behalf of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, but also FIU, join in the aspiration of have women's rights upheld throughout the world, which is certainly a very important part of freedom and democratic values. I would like to rewind a little bit and bring back Amy and Alessandra's remarks overall, because they have an impact in the Americas. The fact that they mentioned the growing number of non-free countries, the absence of international democratic solidarity to protect democracy, which is something that I find very troubling. The overall decrease in better performing countries, the trend that we already have of 15 years of decreasing quality in democratic regimes, the weight that some countries like India or the United States have, and the need to strengthen them in order to allow for regional improvements to take place, the exacerbation of undemocratic trends by the global pandemic, and clearly the role that other countries have been playing in decreasing the quality of democracy, particularly the case of China in the world. Now, I would like to begin my remarks by congratulating Pedro for providing an optimistic perspective, which I think the report overall also highlights the fact that democracy is resilient, and as Martin has said, not only resilient, but rebounds. In other words, the democratic regimes have the capacity through education, through the construction of structures that are more fair, that allow for more opportunities for people to become, to improve the political systems. I think that that is a call to action that we should not forget. So having said that, allow me to make a few notes on the Americas. First of all, clearly we continue to have a very dire situation in Nicaragua and Venezuela. I'll get to Cuba in a little bit, but Nicaragua and Venezuela I would like to stress, because there are reports, as Pedro indicated, both from the Organization of American States as well from the UN, that clearly indicate that in both cases, crimes against humanity have been taking place since at least 2018. They continue today. Both countries are about to have elections under undemocratic conditions, with the opposition being repressed, with political prisoners in their jails. And I think that in both cases, not only the international community, but the American community should take specific action. This has been difficult to achieve at the Organization of American States, because the democratic charter has not been possible to invoke, but it is complicated by the fact that there are other Latin American countries that are actually calling for the defense of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua in the international scene. This is the case of the latest manifesto of the Grupo de Puebla, for example, which continues to support that idea. Cuba, obviously, with the repression of the San Isidro movement, is also there, and it continues to be in the list of undemocratic countries. So that's one factor that I think should be emphasized. The second one is the key role of the media, and here again, I think that there is a double concern. On the one hand, traditional repression in the media. I don't have to elaborate on it. Pedro has already mentioned it. But on the other hand, this is the downside of technology, the networks, and the realm, the kingdom of anonymity that they have brought upon the transmission of information, and the lack of ethical controls that would allow for the opinion to be responsibly founded and grounded. I find that some media outlets have placed themselves in a very comfortable position of attacking democracy without enough proof. There's this whole issue about fake news, the whole issue about lawfare, the use of the judicial tools to attack the establishment, either politicians, political parties, institutions, etc., that need, I think, some kind of response from the media itself. I'm not saying of state-imposed laws or anything to that regard, but this whole ethical issue I find very, very important. You know, the lack of accountability on some of the media's coverage is something that I dread. And I find that it is necessary for Pedro and journalists in general to attend to this essential factor. And then there's also the problem of COVID in the Latin American region and the authoritarian reactions or the lack of reaction that certain countries like Brazil or Mexico or have taken, or in the case of El Salvador, a harsh response to try to control the pandemic via non-democratic actions. On the other hand, and this is something that I would like to mention in closing, Latin America is the country, the region, the world region after Europe that has the highest democratic scores of this report. 60% of our population, of our countries, I'm sorry, of our countries live under some kind of democratic rule. And that is that is good news, because there are positive developments in the region, including what has happened in Suriname, Chile, and Bolivia, which have been mentioned, as well as Ecuador in the report. So I find that having this tool is a very important one to coalesce in turn surrounding democracy with solidarity and with positive actions. And I cannot but support the idea that education is a crucial element in the defense of democracy, and the whole possibility of teaching, for example, civics, not the traditional civics that supported nationalism and ridiculous claims of national superiority, but education for global ideals and global values as something that I find essential to change the course of this trend that we are seeing for the last 15 years, and that we would like to stop in the next few years, so that democracy can flourish around the world and clearly improve the situation in the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this excellent contribution. I see that now we have at least 35 minutes, so I would like to invite those who are watching us or following this conversation to come up with their questions, remarks, and I will try to do my best to accommodate them. Let me start with my own question. I think it's almost my obsession, because of my background in human rights movement back in Czechoslovakia. Obviously, the challenge is to have an effective connection between the world of governments, interstate organizations, and their communication channels, and the ways how policies are formed in this context, and the civil society. Civil society is maybe a third party here. Sometimes their voices can be registered, but are not always transformed into effective action as a, I would say, catalysator of change. Your report, Freedom House report, is certainly very important information about the state of the world. But the question is, who is reading it? And what are the consequences readers of this report take from it for their own actions? Just in the case of the United States, certainly we are now all following very closely the formulation of new policies of the Biden administration. What is very encouraging signal is international projection. The United States is back, and democracy is maybe a point that should be high on agenda of this administration. So tell me how we can eventually improve the effectivity and to make this communication something that really is essential part of international political debates today. whoever wants to step in.
Martin, may I make just a comment that I find interesting to put in the context of your question, and that regards the United States. The report is very strongly critical of what happened in the United States through the past year, mostly under the Trump administration. And you have correctly said that there are a number of steps that the new administration is taking to ensure that some of the issues that were put forward during the previous one will not repeat themselves. Yet, during the past week or two, we have seen local, state institutions in the United States, legislatures, moving to limit democratic rights, especially in electoral terms. You know, something that could bring about a wave of very discouraging actions against democracy in the state level. And that is something that I hope will not last, because even when the federal government may be pushing in a different direction, we all know that because of the importance of local structures and particularly state autonomy in the United States, this could have a very negative impact in the long run over what continues to be one of the most important democratic actors in the hemisphere.
Thank you very much for this reaction. And I have here the first question from Ileana Fuentes. How can democracy, education, be made a global priority when education is in the hands and control of individual states, some of which are dictatorially ruled? Once a curriculum is chosen, how does one make it global? Someone wants to step in. Alessandra or Amy?
I can jump in here. I think you bring up a really good point. Curriculums are set by governments, and sometimes, as in the United States, it's fractured. States set the curriculum. So it's a really good question how to make this global. And I think one way is by involving civil society and providing support to civil society in more authoritarian settings, and providing the tools they might need to kind of push for changes in curriculum and such.
Anyone else wants to step in? Okay, I see here another question from Jean Rosenberg. A number of Latin American leaders seem to be more enthusiastic about supporting democracy after they have left office than while they are in office. Why can they be more supportive, effective while in office? Maybe that's for you, Luis.
Yeah, well, I don't know if Jean is referring to me personally. I hope not, because I hope that I was very supportive of democratic values and institutions while I was president of Costa Rica, which fortunately remains as one of the most solid democracies in the world and in the Americas, according to the report. I don't know if that's the case, but I don't want to generalize. Obviously, there are leaders that are more democratic than others, but it is true that there are a number of constraints that would allow political leaders to operate within their own countries during the time they are in government, with less capacity to uphold certain kinds of relations, for example, in terms of the legislative assemblies, or even with civil society at times, than when they are out of office. It's easier to be critical and of certain trends when you are not in the seat. So in all frankness, I think that has to do with the circumstance. But one would hope that Democrats would uphold the rule of law, would uphold if personal and economic freedoms, would uphold the equality of human rights for everyone. when they're in office and when they are out of office. And if there are some politicians that are not doing that, they should be named specifically and provided the evidence that this is something that that didn't happen under their watch.
Another question, Sebastian Aranguiwel, how do we incentivize industry in democratic countries and beyond to promote democratic values? So the role of private sector. Who wants to take care about this question?
If I may. Oh, Alexandra, you wanted to jump in.
No, you go first.
Ahead. No,
You go
go
first.
first, you.
Well, I just wanted to give more general comments on the importance of civil society and what the democratic leaders can do, in the sense that the solidarity, the international solidarity that President Solis was mentioning is essential and can take forms, can take very different forms, in the sense that, first of all, it's important that the United States and the European Union countries and the European Union per se are going in the same direction. For example, in the case of Cuba, especially, we need very much a multilateral commitment. Unfortunately, we know that in Cuba, there are two different kinds of civil society. We have the civil society that is very much allied with the government, and the independent civil society. And we know that the independent civil society, for example, is not part of the dialogue with the European Union. So it's our responsibility as countries that are democracy and want to support the democracy to provide the voice and the right space to civil society that has been mentioned in this panel, has a very important role. In terms of the free economy, for example, Cuba is again another important example. We know that just in the last couple of weeks, the government said that it's going to open more space to what they are called the cuentapropistas, some sort of like free entrepreneur. And this is very important. And we recognize that in a moment of economic crisis, financial crisis, these initiatives are good, but they need to go in parallel with human rights. As we could see from the evolution of China, we don't have the right development if it's just at the economic level. It's very important that international firms that invest in this country feel the responsibility to have human rights respected, especially the human rights of the people.
Thank you. And now, Pedro.
No, I want to put a comment that I think could target a little bit that last question. And I think that there's a huge challenge. I mean, how do we match as societies human rights, democratic values with several activities that are happening among our countries? No? So I think that the categories of the report are useful to state like some actions that could be triggered. I mean, for the free countries, no, I think we have to protect the rule of law, and we have to protect the check and balances that are like the safeguards of some, let's say, authoritarian trends or expressions that are not like consolidated, but are there. In the not free countries, I think we have to encourage an international commitment. No? And we have to, for example, we have to claim for those governments to receive visits from the international human rights bodies, no, like the Commission of Human Rights, like the UN, because it's also a way to open a discussion about how to protect human rights. And we have to protect in those countries the critical voices. I mean, the risk that journalists, that artists, that social movements are facing in these three countries they're a high risk, and we have to protect those voices like Movimiento San Isidro or journalists in Nicaragua. For the partly free countries, which I think is I mean, we have to put efforts for them not to get and decline in the not free countries. I think we have to manage the anxiety of societies. We are in the middle of a lot of contents, and it seems that for those who are in power, there's a rush of protecting that power at no cost. I mean, at any cost. For those who are in the opposition, there's like a rush to beat that power at no cost. And I also would say that there's a rush to profit on the private sector that should be slowed down if protecting human rights and democratic values is what is in the middle. No? And that brings me to something that we could discuss in another moment. I mean, this predictable economy, this surveillance economy, this rush of profit without ethics, it's something that we have to discuss a little bit more, because I think that it's in the middle of democratic elections, that is in the middle of hate speech, that it's, I mean, there are a lot of ingredients that poisons our democracies if we do not step down from some profits that could be an additional cost to the decline of democracy. So summarizing it, I think we have to match human rights and democratic values with every activity we have in our society. That includes private sector and political participation and journalism and all of those three activities.
Thank you very much. Next question, Floris Warnenburg, concerns Nicaragua. Nicaragua has lost 28 points on the freedom scale in the last decade, now being unfree. So what is the effect on the ground of this trend for lawyers and maybe civil society actors or other actors of society? And what can be said about upcoming elections in Nicaragua? Can this be a moment of change or not?
Well, if I may, Martin, I think that the situation in Nicaragua requires a lot of creativity on the part of the international community and also a lot of courage on the part of the political opposition. There are a number of tools that still can be used in the case of Nicaragua, even when it is a very solid dictatorship and a very violent one, as the human rights reports have attested. In my perspective, the responsibility of the opposition to unite and to find a common agenda and also a common leadership is going to be very, very important. And in doing so, I think that they have to continue to address the principal violations of human rights that the regime has been creating. I mean, the vast majority of the people of Nicaragua, I think, oppose the regime of Ortega and Rosario Murillo, but they are spread all over the place in terms of because the regime has been very able to, through repression, exacerbate the differences within the opposition and introduce fear in the population. So I think that in the case of Nicaragua, the question of political leadership in the upcoming elections is essential, and also the accompanying of the international community, which again the report highlights as one of the most fundamental parts in this in democratic construction and buildup.
Let's go for the next. I'm sorry. Okay. We are now going out from the region up Hishek Gore's question. What can normal citizens in India do where political leaders and parties are more dominant and have more resources to harass, abuse truthful journalism or citizens? How can citizens help the nation not to fall into a totalitarian regime? wants to take this one?
I can try to tackle this. I'm curious for others to hear how civil society has worked in similar environments in Latin America. But I think a big thing is that it can be really helpful for activists to connect with each other, both within the country and also across borders, and be able to kind of share different strategies and tools and other approaches that should be prioritized. So kind of linking together and creating a stronger force against some of this. I'm curious to hear what others think, though.
Other comments to this question? So I'll go to the next one. Miriam Conbrith from FIU. Looking at the 15 years trends, what is your assessment of what may happen in the near future? Will more countries in the Americas become freer? And will they move to the partially free or non-free countries? Will we see further decline or some reversal of this trend?
I can start. I think at the current rate we're going, it seems like more decline is in the near future, particularly with the pandemic. I think that's really exacerbated this 15 years of deterioration. One thing that I think is really interesting is a lot of score declines in the Americas were actually related to the pandemic. So in El Salvador, for example, really harsh enforcement of lockdown measures. We kind of saw similar dynamics before the pandemic started, with the use of security services to disrupt parliament and to help the president kind of assert his power. So I think this is kind of providing another way for this decline to further and kind of an excuse for anti-democratic or authoritarian actors to continue on this route.
Thank you.
If I can add a couple of points, I completely agree with Amy. The expectation is really that unfortunately it's very hard that we imagine like a change in trends, especially because we are still in the middle of COVID, especially if we look at the Latin American region. We do not expect a vaccine coming available for the entire population soon. And so on the one hand, we are in the middle of pandemic. On the other hand, so the restoration of normality is still something far. And at the same time, civil society in the middle of a pandemic is having a very hard time to be functional and in full expression. So these are all elements that make everything harder for improvements.
Yeah, in principle, I would say that the trend is negative, and it will continue to be so, unfortunately, even when I want to see the glass half full. But I'm particularly concerned about the economic consequences of the pandemic. If the governments and the international multilateral financial organizations are not able to put policies that will increase employment, that will allow for more investment to come to our countries. Countries are extremely sensitive to foreign direct investment, for example. If we're not able to incorporate more women into the economy, because women being caretakers, because of the limitations of these countries not being incorporated there, that's half of the population of our countries in Latin America. It is going to be very difficult to come out of this political circumstance, undemocratic circumstance.
Okay. Not very, I would say, hopeful position or opinion. Next question, Ileana Fuentes, concerning Cuba. The European Union's ambassador to Cuba, Alberto Navarro, recently stated that Cuba was not a dictatorship. Now, many EU parliamentarians are demanding his removal. What to do?
Well,
okay, go ahead, please.
Unfortunately, this is not the first time that we hear this kind of definition of Cuba. Unfortunately, in 2016, the European Union defined Cuba a one-party democracy in the report. So I think that the concern is not just on this claim or in this statement of Ambassador Navarro. We really need to see the problem at the roots. The roots is that, unfortunately, we need to face the reality. The European Union very often has a romantic vision of Cuba, and we need to see with the eyes of political scientists that there is no democracy when there is only one country, and the name of that regime is completely different from democracy, and it's just like a one-party dictatorship. So I think that it's very important to strengthen the voice of independent civil society, independent media, bring them to Brussels and have them meeting the representative of the European Parliament, but also of the External Action Service, because it's important that not only the representative of the European people, but also who has the executive power can meet these important actors.
Thank you very much. That's a very clear answer. I only can stress my point, how important it is that the connection between voices of civil society and those who play a role in interstate relations is, I would say, effective, and that these people in Brussels, in this case, listen to what Cuban people think about that evaluation of their form of government. Next question is from Gerardo Berthin. Gerardo Berthin. This year and next year, many countries in Latin America are undergoing electoral process. And a shift of balance could take place towards more authoritarian and anti-democratic trends. The Freedom House report recommend investing in alliances with other democracies and in multilateral institutions. In our region, how should we encourage this alliance and who can lead the effort?
Well, I think that there are already a number of groups, of ad hoc groups, as well as institutions that are trying to contribute in that sense. The OAS, the UN, obviously, but also groups of former presidents of all sorts. There are, of course, differences in perspectives. I mentioned the group of Puebla. That's one. There's IDEA. That's another one with very different perspectives on how things should be moving at. And then there are all obviously other venues. For example, the Inter-American Press Association and parliamentarian groups, etc. I think that the advantage that we have, quote unquote, in Latin America vis-a-vis the elections is that in many of the countries that are going to be holding them, the regime is not undemocratic, but only partially democratic. And that allows for what Pedro has been calling for more education, more civics, more presence of international actors that would not be otherwise admitted in countries like Cuba or Nicaragua or Venezuela. And in that sense, my response to Gerardo would be that there is an articulation that needs to be done. I don't know if there's any specific individual that can do it, but clearly there are hemispheric mechanisms that are already in place that will continue to have play a very important role in the Americas. For example, the OAS, which has the frameworks on which this could be done, for example, in terms of electoral observations. This is also true for the Carter Center and other think tanks that operate and have been very collaborative with civil society entities in many Latin American countries in the past.
Okay, next question again from Eliana Fuentes. Actually, it's a very pertinent question because we celebrate or commemorate today International Women's Day. So the question is about women. In what ways, in your individual opinions, does the absence of democracy and freedoms affect women and girls in particular?
I think the democratic decline that we're seeing who it affects most of all are marginalized groups, including girls and women. So I think we're seeing a lot of anti-democratic or authoritarian, anti-democratic leaders within partly free or free settings really kind of pander to their base and kind of forget that their purpose is to serve all people, not just their base. And when that happens, that really impacts people like girls and women, racial minorities, ethnic minorities, all types of groups. So I think the decline of democracy is incredibly linked to how this is impacting girls and women. And then when you have another crisis on top of this, the COVID-19 pandemic, that is going to exacerbate these inequalities that are already in place. On top of that, there's an economic recession, which is going to catalyze that further. So I think paying attention and making sure we can help girls and women and other marginalized groups is incredibly important.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just watching the time because we are heading to the end of this session. We still have a couple of minutes. I would love to give to all of you space for final statement. But let me come up with my own question. And don't take it as a criticism of Freedom House human rights reporting. My question concerns the presence of the past. Actually, in the last days, Organization for Washington Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation had a negotiation in Tallahassee trying to bring into Florida high school education the experience of countries that were going through this not very, I would say, happy experience in the past decades. So it seems to me that each of these countries has also its own version of history. And one of the key things for the, I would say, more hopeful future of democracy is to take this presence of the past in their countries into consideration, because it affects identities of individuals, their collective memories in the families, and then obviously it can make them susceptible to sometimes very brutal state propaganda and trying to silence the voices of others who certainly would like to bring these questions into the current debate and maybe turn it into also a theme of future election. What do you think about the presence of the past?
Well, definitely the legacies coming from the past are an important aspect, also because the cultural, each country has their own history and their own culture. And those are elements that are definitely important to consider. I think that it's also extremely important to consider the sharing the experience where activists and civil society, political leaders can actually share lessons learned with countries that went through the same or similar processes in other parts of the world. Of course, for example, sometimes we wonder when we organize similar situations, how important is the cultural component, how can make the difference. But it's also important to remember that human rights are universal rights. And so all of us, it doesn't matter where we come from, where we live, we have the right to live human rights, and we can still learn from the successful story in other parts of the countries, in other parts, of the world, despite the difference in culture. But we also need to be alert that one size does not fit all. So this means that we then need to contextualize the lessons learned and make sure that they are appropriate and make sense in the country where we are trying to implement them.
Well, being a professional historian, I have to say that I do find the lessons of the past to be essential not to repeat the errors of the past. And therefore, I absolutely concur with Alessandra in the sense that both the local history in Latin America as well as the international world history is relevant. You know, to recall, to learn from the atrocities of communism and fascism, for example, at a time when I see fascist or neo-fascist, neo-Nazi values popping up everywhere as part of this authoritarian trend, or populism, which is another source of grave concern. All of that, I think, needs to be studied and put in context and certainly taught, so that the new generations and the present generations do not forget of the consequences of not learning about history in the past.
Thank you very much. I just wanted now to give each of you 1 minute for your final comments, but we can easily combine that with the last contribution to our discussion, Annabelle Navarro. Thanks for this event, for all of you. What else do you think civil society can do in countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, where sometimes could feel like civil society has done everything, and maybe still without effect? So please, each of you has 1 minute for your final statement, and thank you very much. Who wants to start?
I can start.
Pedro, you can use my minute, because I think you've been raising your hand all the time and you were not acknowledged. So use my minute. I'll gladly give it to you.
No,
Please go ahead.
Okay, no, I'll be very, very, very quick. With two ideas, I think there's a dilemma in the whole region between to impose an idea and to share and debate an idea or an ideal. No? I think that's the tricky border in which we're walking through. No? We have a lot of leaders and a lot of portions of the population that want to impose an idea, and we have to call them to share their idea, not to impose it. And when that is happening while the people is empowered, I think that could be something we should be taking care of. And I would like to, it would be like a mix between the question of Miriam and the last question. I think we have to pay attention about the bottom of the list in Latin America on this report. Why? Because I think for the people in Cuba, in Nicaragua, and in Venezuela, this moment could be so frustrating, because we all as international community are talking about their countries almost every day, no? And we are putting a lot of efforts in what is happening there, but things seems not to be changing in the way that we expect it to be. And also the situation in these countries are looked by other leaders. So if there's no consequence for having a restrictive country or a restrictive government, other countries that are in the range of partial free, no, partly free, could be encouraged to become a not free country, because there's no a consequence. And I would like to say that the forum of the OAS, that the effort of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and from the Special Rapporteur Office is useful for two things. The first one is we are monitoring the situation every day. So when things or when the situation could change, we also would like to raise our hands and say things are getting better in these countries. But if the pattern or the trend goes in decline, we also are providing information to multi-stakeholders, to actors, to keep putting their eyes on restrictions to freedom.
Thank you very much. And now, ladies, please be brief and your final words.
Okay, I will connect my final words with very much what Pedro just said, in the sense that we know that the three countries that are the most concerning countries are Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. But it's important that we don't leave these countries as casos perdidos, lost cases. We need to keep the attention. We have a new administration in the United States. Europe is going to be out of, hopefully, of COVID in the next year. It's important that the attention is going to turn in these countries, even if they are possibly geographically remote from Europe. It's important that the democracies of this region are going to play a protagonist role with the support of the United States and the European country. There are lots of stakes and lots of instruments at the international level. Let's just think the impact of the fact-finding mission report last September. We have important appointments at the Human Rights Council. Let's not forget that both Venezuela and Cuba are part of this council. So it's important that the Latin American countries don't allow this to happen again. And they have the ability. Costa Rica tried against Venezuela, and we need more courage countries and preparing with lots of advance.
I agree with all of that. I'll just say over the past few years, there's really been an inconsistent presence of leadership from major democracies, particularly the United States. And with the Biden administration, I'm really hopeful that more democratic countries will kind of link together and be able to call out abuses as they see them and really try to hold these actors accountable for their actions.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it was an excellent discussion. And let me to conclude with very, very old idea. Maybe now I feel very relevant here in the United States. It is Aristotle who once said that there should be some sort of primordial original agreement between people concerning the difference between good life, and by good life, even free life and democracy, and just life only. And it seems to me that this agreement sometimes is very difficult to be achieved. We see that in the United States, President Trump is gone, and we still have this discussion rather ending in blind alleys in conflicts and not in this original agreement. So I hope and pray that this discussion maybe helped us to think more deeply and more creatively and in a future-oriented manner about what does it mean, the difference between good life in democracy and just life that is controlled by some authoritarian or populistic leaders. So thank you very much, and let's hope that we will be able to continue in this conversation, because it should have by definition no end, and should certainly bring us to a better future, hopefully. Thank you very much.